is someone who is able to lead the Deems because they don't have the intellectual and psychological and emotional resources to understand the directions in which he is trying to lead them. They're not, let's say, educated. They're not as aware. They're not as interested in current political events nearby and far afield, so they can more easily be led to follow a charismatic leader who says, follow me. So democracy and demagoguery can be quite the opposite of each other, even though the point in common is that the people has a voice. And the people is defined not by its wealth and not by its land holdings and not by the other kinds of criteria that had formerly served and have served through most of history in so many places, but something which was, in a sense, you might almost say arbitrary. If I can fast forward from Athens in the 6th and 5th pre-Christian centuries for a moment to France at the end of the 18th century, you may recall that beginning in 1789, there was a revolution that was inspired in part by the American Revolution against the English king, against the French monarchy, Louis XVI, the outcome of which was a success which then was devoured by the next group, and in the course of which many people lost their heads, and I mean that literally, of course, not figuratively, including Louis XVI and his family. And if you follow French history, you will observe that something resembling a democratic form of government, a republican form of government, res publica being the people's thing, that's a Latin turn of phrase, democracy is a Greek turn of phrase, that a truly republican, successful, stable republican form of government didn't really set into France until the end of the 19th century, the Third Republic. So it took almost 100 years. It took almost 100 years for democracy to really arrive into France after the revolution. And if we push that calendar another half step forward, we will next year be celebrating, if that's the proper verb, the centenary of the Russian Revolution. That beginning in February of 1917, led by one group, the Mensheviks, that was then supplanted by November by another group, the Bolsheviks, that then took power and under Lenin seemed, in spite of 7 years of civil war, to be moving in a democratic direction. With his death in 1924, found itself ensconced in a battle at the top, out of which ultimately Stalin emerged, and after Stalin a succession of other individuals, such that even with the collapse of the Soviet Union that Lenin had organized about, what now, 25 years ago, the smoke clears and Russia has yet to arrive at a democratic system, even though nominally on paper that's exactly what it's got. It's got a republic. It's got a prime minister. It's got a president. It's got someone who's duly elected. It just so happens that Putin is president for life. It's not likely that he will cease to be the leader of Russia in the near future unless by some accident. It's not what is in the plan that he has. It's not what the people expect. So democracy is not an easy thing to arrive at, particularly if the place with which one is dealing has had a long history of what is not democracy, but is some form of autocracy, ruled by a self-willed individual, monarchy, head by one, demagoguery, an individual who through charisma or other means is able to lead or to force to be led a people, however technically on paper it appears to be led by the kinds of principles that were starting a very slow development under Cleisthenes in Athens 2,500, give or take 2,500 years ago. So if we look at Turkey, I don't know why it just occurs to me, why not look at Turkey just as long as we're here? Turkey has a very, very long history. I mean, a long history. We can go back to the Hittites and the Hurrians, and we can move forward to the Phrygians and the Luwians and the Lycians, and we can move forward to Hellenistic kingdoms, Halicarnassus, Mausolus, who builds a temple, a tomb to himself that looks like a temple and in fact is called the tomb or temple of Mausolus, the Mausoleon, or in Latin, Mausolea, that's where, as you all know, the word comes from. We can follow it forward through the Roman period, and we can follow it through the later Roman period, which we otherwise call Byzantine, and through the Seljuk, and a long 6 centuries of Ottoman rule. And my point is, through all of that, its governance is autocratic. Its governance is monarchic of one sort or another. By the way, that kind of government is not always necessarily a poor form of government. If you have what Plato would call a philosopher king in charge, then in fact he would say it's the best kind of government. Because then you're led by one individual who is wise, who is not greedy, who is not in it for himself, but genuinely in it for the people. The problem is that's a rarity. In fact, Plato found when he had an opportunity to create such a figure in Syracuse that he couldn't do it, because somehow coming to power, the formerly interested in others individual became power hungry. Out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, by 1923, a gentleman whose name is familiar to most of you, by the name of Ataturk, creates what he looks at as a forward-moving modernist republic. He changes the writing system to make it more in accord with the West, and to use a writing system more conducive to the sound patterns of Turkish than the Arabic writing system is, as most of you know. Arabic is very rich in consonants and far less rich in vowels, certainly vowel nuances, and Turkish, of course, has as one of its essential features its vowel coloration, which Arabic can't really represent effectively. He found it more effective to use the Latin alphabet with modifications in order to do that. And in theory put in place a modern secular, for the first time in 600 years, a secular Turkish state, which was conceived as a republic. Except that, of course, Ataturk didn't step down from power until he set foot into the grave. Nor were there political parties that functioned in opposition to his until after his demise. And in the give or take, 70 years since that time, Turkey has evolved as with a democratic republican form of government, a multiple party system, with elections both for elections for a prime minister and also a role for a president who nominally speaks on behalf of the party that is in power, but functionally with respect to how, generally speaking, the government and society operates, is a figurehead. It is the prime minister who is the equivalent of what in the United States would be our president. The system in that regard is more like any number of European systems or the Israeli system. You may have a president, but it's the prime minister who is the functionally the person of power. And one of the things that one observes evolving further with the system and how it plays out, socially and not just politically, is that the rigor with which Ataturk wanted Turkey to be secular because of his conviction that the only kind of state that could offer openness to everybody was a secular state, that in fact functionally meant more often than not that Islam, which traditionally had been the majority of the Turkish state, however large under the Ottomans or shrunken it became, found itself on the outside. Not an even playing field, but in fact, more often than not, oppressed. And over the course of the, give or take, 70 years since the time of Ataturk to our own time, one observes, it seems to me, three features that are particular to Turkey that continue to play out and in a very different way are still playing out today. One is the question of what it means, and this is a question, by the way, that every nation asks itself, or should, continually, never finding the answer, and that is, what does it mean to be Turkish? What does it mean to be Turkey? And part of the question within that question is, what is our identity as something secular, as something Islamic, as something Islamist, I want to make that distinction, as something that is Islamic and yet open to all forms of faith? What is it that we're supposed to be? And one can see within the last 25 or so years how the pendulum with respect to who has been prime minister has swung back and forth a bit between different senses of what that means. So whereas there have been the secularist leaders, there have been the Islamic or even the Islamist leaders. And the second feature that I would identify as particular is that the army has been consistently secularist, has consistently stepped in when a leader has been perceived as too Islamist, and interestingly, and this is unique, when the army has stepped in, for the most part, with a coup d'etat, of which there seems to come one about every 10 years or so, it doesn't then stay in power. It holds elections, it has held elections pulled back so that the democratic form of Turkey remains. And the third feature, besides the notion of secular versus Islamic versus Islamist versus whatever, what are we trying to be, and the question of the role of the army in fomenting coups and then stepping back. The third feature is, how do things at certain points become muddier than they might have been before? So about 15 years ago, a man by the name of Erdogan, having been very successful as the mayor of Istanbul, forward-looking, modernizing in the positive sense of that turn of phrase, manages to become prime minister. His party, the AKP, becomes the dominant party, and over the next several terms, in fact, his party's hand is strengthened. The opposition's, because there were multiple parties, weaken, and his position seems to be stronger than ever. So politically, he is in the driver's seat very much. And the interesting thing is he presents himself as strongly Islamic, not an Islamist, but as Islamic. And as such, he seems to be in step with, for example, a religious leader like Fethullah Gulen, who by then is living in Pennsylvania, not in Turkey, but who has developed an extraordinary following of individuals who are inspired by his preachings, his teachings, his writings, his sermons, for which, if I can reduce them down, the emphases are, 1, altruism, thinking not about yourself but about others. 2, not just thinking but acting on the basis of that. 3, as such, serving others, so that what evolves to a movement inspired by him ends up being called by the Turkish word for service, hizmet, the hizmet movement. 4, specifically where Turkey is concerned, that Turkey lost its way when it lost touch with its 1,000-year heritage of being an Islamic state, and that the path forward for Turkey is to reclaim that sense of itself, not, and this is essential and important, at the cost of depriving other forms of faith of a place within the state. One of the things one recognizes, for example, is that, well, I know Emra's here, because his sneeze can be recognized 1,000 miles away. By the way, in the Slovakian tradition, a sneeze indicates that what is about to be said is not true. So I just want you to understand he's Turkish. Well, he's an Australian Turk. He speaks Australian with a Turkish accent and Turkish with an Australian accent. He ain't no Slovak, so ignore the sneeze behind the wall. That with respect to Turkey, one of the things about which Gulen becomes increasingly emphatic is the Islamic soul needs to be restored, but not at the cost of closing Turkey up to other forms of faith. And one of the things, in fact, that one observes in Turkey's history is that if you look through the Ottoman period, for example, there are many more Christians and Jews involved in the government that are involved in Ataturk's government. So Ataturk's secular government is actually much more Islamist in function than the Ottomans had been in fundamental ways. So the Hizmet movement, inspired by Gulen, I bring up because the fact that Gülen and Erdogan seemed to be on parallel tracks at the outset of Erdogan's first regime meant that Gülen offered support to Erdogan. Mind you, another feature of Gülen's thinking is to distinguish political from civil Islam. And what he teaches and preaches about is civil Islam, not political Islam. One of the principles by which he abides is an Islamic principle, is that you don't overthrow the person in power just because you don't like the person in power. That's not appropriate. You work to change the person or to change the power structure, but you don't overthrow a Muslim ruler in a Muslim country. That's inappropriate. And that's a principle that still remains in place for Fethullah Gülen today. So, I'm coming close to the denouement of my remarks and the point at which I will pass over the baton to my colleague. On 3 successive occasions, Mr. Gülen is in support of Mr. Erdogan because he perceives him as offering the same sort of principles, although certain things seem to be changing by the 3rd round. Erdogan seems to be more public about his praying, something that would be called shirk of the tertiary sort, that which is condemned in Islam. You don't show off, and in this case, he's showing off his Islam, because it smacks of something which is not real. If you are truly a Muslim, you don't have to blast everybody with it. You just are it. And more it seems that Erdogan, when he wants to show how Muslim he is blasting. Things come to a double head, it seems to me. One is that the clock runs out on his ability to continue to be prime minister, and what we observe is a change in the political system functionally, which is that Erdogan, who will now become president, continues to be the man in charge, rather than the prime minister being the man in charge. It's a subtle but not insignificant change in how the government operates, because it means that one man continues to be in charge, whatever you want to call it, president for life, prime minister for life, or I prefer the word demagogue, because that indeed, or autocrat, is what has evolved. His model in this regard, you can recognize, it's right in front of your faces. It's Putin, the guy I mentioned a few moments back. We see them, his parallel is not Gülen, his parallel is Putin. Second, one can observe the beginning of a separation between Gülen and Erdogan. Both because, from Gülen's point of view, clearly Erdogan's behavior seems to be contradicting what seemed to be the pattern earlier on, and what seemed to create the basis for an alliance earlier on. But also, I think from Erdogan's point of view, I don't care who you are, Dorian Gray if you've read Oscar Wilde, or Mr. Erdogan, when you look in the mirror and you don't like what you see, even though no one else can see what's in the mirror, it makes you very uncomfortable. If in your gut you know that you're not what you profess to be, and here is this guy out there, even though he's 10,000 miles away, who in fact is the very things you claim to be but are not, which is a genuine Muslim, but who also happens to be a universalist, even as he is a Muslim, then that's going to make you very uncomfortable. The association with him is going to make you increasingly uncomfortable. So from the Erdogan perspective, the need to distance himself from Gülen will be felt ever more strongly. A third development is it in 2013, when, in part, I imagine, inspired by the kinds of protests that expressed themselves in the previous year across 18 different Arab countries in the period known as the Arab Spring, of which perhaps the most famous is that which took place in Tahrir Square in Cairo, that led to the removal from power of Mubarak and the put into power of a new system, at least temporarily. In the end, Egypt is back where it began, but that's another story. Perhaps inspired in part by that, people took the streets when Mr. Erdogan announced that the trees and everything else that were part of Gezi Park were to be removed in favor of some sort of a building complex, and I suppose it was just coincidental that the builders and those who would profit from it were his friends. And his response to that And the reason I make the comparison with Tahrir Square, because in Tahrir Square, at that time, interestingly, the Egyptian army was behind the protesters and protecting them. And that's part of what enabled it to succeed. In Gezi Park, Erdogan's response, this is a Democrat, this is the head of the republic, this is the people's man. It was not to come out and speak with the people. It was to send in the forces to beat up the people. And in retrospect, that failed protest and other events that followed thereafter, from the mining disaster to the east, to the financial scandals of a few months later, in which his conversations with his son were to be found on tape, his, it seems to me, rat-in-a-corner desperation quotient, that's DQ, rose at a very steady clip. And you ask yourself, what is someone whose nature seems to be not democratic as you thought, or even Islamic as you thought, but simply demagogic, as he's proving, day by day by day, what will his response be to what amount to demands for a greater accountability that are presumably part of what you expect in a democratic government? And his response is to eliminate the rights that enable it, that make it possible for people to respond. The two things that strike me most interesting about the events, particularly of the last, let's say, 6 months, is that one, a coup takes place on July 15th, a coup which has every earmark of not being real. We don't know exactly who's leading it. It seems to have no leadership. It seems to have no organization. The time of the coup is rush hour, not the middle of the night when you arrest the people you need to arrest. Mr. Erdogan is there, Johnny on the spot, to call upon his people as soon, practically, as things get going. And the aftermath, of course, is a massive series of arrests so fast that it suggests that there was a list already in hand. Everything about the coup, in fact, suggests that not only was it a failed coup, it was a coup intended to fail because the perpetrator of the coup is Mr. Erdogan himself. And I will stand by that. I cannot absolutely prove it, but everything I've heard since July, every place I go, I hear more things, whether it has to do with what was going on internally at that point, what has happened since, or whether I'm hearing about what British intelligence undercovered in terms of, overheard in terms of conversations the day before the coup. And one of the things they heard was, just make sure this gets blamed on the Gulenists. Which brings me to the second feature of this. So human rights have all but disappeared in the Turkey of post-July 15th. I don't have to tell you how many tens and 20s and hundreds of thousands of people are at least out of jobs with no hope even for picking up a broom and sweeping the streets as a job. But under lock and key, I don't have to tell you, you're going to hear more about it, I suspect, in a few moments, about the fact that there simply is no press in opposition to the official party organs, so that there is no ability one way or another for Turks to know what's going on, much less to express their opinions about what is going on. That's part of it. The second feature is, and this is consistent with a different ruler from Putin, this is more consistent with someone like Adolf Hitler in the 1930s, as he assumed the chancellorship in 1933 in Germany. He looked for a scapegoat that could help him unify Germans against a reliable enemy. The reliable enemy was the Jews. The reliable enemy for Mr. Erdogan has become his men, Gulen, the Gulenists. They have become the scapegoats for everything. We may hear more about that, or more in Q&A can be discussed about that. The one feature that I think stands out in my mind as symptomatic is this, and then I will hand over the baton. One of the features that makes a democracy work is education, because the difference between democracy and demagoguery, as I said toward the beginning of my remarks, is whether or not you have an educated electorate that can really make informed decisions about what and whom they choose. No education, less ability. It's a very simple formula to make those kinds of choices. More education, more opportunities. They may not make the right choices, but you have a greater likelihood when things play out of that happening. If you remove education as a factor, then you've got a problem. One of the abiding features of the Hizmet movement with respect to action, not just words, has been education. So within Turkey and beyond Turkey, in 170 countries, you have Hizmet people engaged in building and running schools. Now it should be noted very clearly that the schools inside and outside Turkey are run by Hizmet people who are Muslim. They're not Muslim schools. They are run as secular schools. They're run in Turkey according to the prescriptions of the secular government. What they do, however, is provide teachers, administrators who really care about their students. And as a consequence, the outcomes in their schools tend to be superior from the outcomes in non-Hizmet schools, whether in Turkey or outside Turkey. Well, I find it interesting that one of the first focal points of Mr. Erdogan's attacks on Hizmet has been the demand that their schools be shut down, and that has been, as you know, done in a series of steps, the most recent extending internationally, and the last set of schools, as far as I know, to be shut down about 2 weeks ago were in Pakistan. Okay? Contrast that with one of the Hizmet colleges that I just visited in Sydney, Australia about a week and a half ago. Okay? I just want to tell you about a project. It's a gardening project. On the school grounds, the students from kindergarten to 12th grade, all the levels are engaged in producing a range of organic vegetables. Okay? So what is the point of this exercise? One, from the age of 5 to the age of 18, they have a sense of what it takes to make food. It doesn't appear magically on the shelves of your grocery store. What does it take for a farmer? What happens when the weather is bad? When it rains too much, it doesn't rain enough. They get a sense of all that from an early age to a later age. The stuff that they work slave over to produce, which is more or less successful, provides the neighborhood with organic vegetables that they can't otherwise get. The profits go to support an orphanage in Africa. So they're also learning social responsibility in a very direct kind of way. Not a penny of it goes to them. It goes to the orphanage in Africa. To me, that's a perfect picture of what Hizmet is about and the way it works in the school setting at an ideal, and the notion that that's something that Mr. Erdogan is bound and determined to eliminate says volumes, to come full circle to where it began, about whether Turkey at the present and in the immediate future is a democracy or a demagoguery. And then the next question is, so what will change it? And the answer probably is, if the economic bubble collapses and Turks who have no way of really understanding what Erdogan is all about realize that whatever he's about, it isn't benefiting them in a very practical way. But that's something that's speculative and can be talked about more later. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Soltes. I think it's a good theoretical framework so that I can build my remarks upon that. I will keep my remarks short. Actually, I was kicked out of Turkey for speaking too much. So there's a danger, but don't worry, I will just keep it short today. I think it's important that that we have that kind of theoretical framework so that we can make sense out of the blizzard of information that bombards us daily. And in Turkey, we can see to what extent it can go, where everyday things are happening, perhaps happen in like a decade in other advanced countries. It was 3 years ago, my telephone exploded from messages, calls, phones, and I was wondering what I did again that disturbed someone. And when I went through my Twitter mentions, I saw that Erdogan, then Prime Minister, he was a Prime Minister back then, he was speaking in the Parliament and he called me a liar. And he just told me that everything is okay for me, fine for me, as long as I I'll go to my ends. Every means is legal for me. And so I just wondering why he would say that. 5 days before that incident, I was in Istanbul and I was called into questioning I was going to one of our lawyers from the newspaper, and of course I was worried. I'm not a criminal or a thug, you know. I've never been in a police station or interrogated by police chiefs. So I went there. My lawyer was trying to calm me down. He said, "I've been doing it for a long time. I had lots of cases. Don't worry, you're not going to jail from here. They will just ask you several questions." So I went there. Police chief offered me tea, and perhaps he thought that I would confess easily. So, so that was a case pressed by Prime Minister Erdogan, seeking up to 6 years in prison. So just imagine you are in a foreign country, and then there is a very popular leader targeting you, trying to put you in jail. How would you feel, right? So, so I went there. The police chief asked me why I wrote the story I did, and I said, well, editors asked me to do so. I just threw them under the bus. But he didn't know that I was the editor. So then, you know, I started, you know, listing down how the freedom of media is protected in our constitution, and how Turkey is party to treaties that protect freedom of speech and freedom of expression. So I just left there. A month before that, that incident, I just shared an article about the corruption scandal on December 25th, 2013, and the Turkish media outlets launched a huge smear campaign against me, as if I was trying to show the Turkish government that as if they are protecting Al-Qaeda. And the reason for that, because, you know, I wrote about how a Saudi businessman named Yassin al-Qadi, who has been known as a financier of many radical groups in Syria, and who was listed as a globally designated terrorist by the United States Treasury Department. And then, you know, there was a smear campaign against me, which kind of characterizes how Erdogan is dealing with his opponents. Perhaps, you know, journalists are not being killed in the streets in Turkey, but they are demonized, they are dehumanized, and whenever they say something critically, they are being framed in a way that that defame them. So they're trying to marginalize them, isolate from the mainstream media. 16 years before that incident, you know, Erdogan went to jail for 3 months for reciting a modified version of a poem. And Erdogan used this exactly same Turkish Penal Code article that landed him in jail to sue me, which shows the tremendous transformation that there is in Turkey in 16 years. How he turned from someone, a victim, to someone who is trying to exploit the same article to jail his dissidents. And the Turkish system is actually built on that. It just constantly, it's a vicious cycle, constantly produces revisionist victims who then, when they come to power, they start oppressing others again. And of course, I mean, we had what Andrew Finkel called as a slow motion coup before the July 15 coup attempt. But since then, the crackdown in Turkey has escalated significantly. And the numbers are mind-boggling. We had more than 125,000 people have been dismissed, purged, or sacked. And these include, you know, doctors, members of the judiciary, the police, even soccer referees, the baklava sellers. Just only yesterday they arrested, you know, a shawarma king, right? And perhaps the next would be, you know, the kebab folks. So, in connection with the coup, there are more than 90,000 people have been detained all across Turkey. Half of them were arrested pending trial, and I can only imagine what they're going through, because we have the most educated prison population in the world. Those dingy boats that used to carry Syrian refugees to Greece are now filled with Turkish professors. There's a massive brain drain going on in Turkey. There are more than 7,000 academics have been dismissed from their universities. Nearly 2,000 academics have been arrested, and some of them are really celebrated professors in Turkey. And those who can flee go to the Western countries or to countries that do not require visas from Turks. So when you look at the situation, when the numbers, when you look how numbers are big, it lessens the impact. We get used to this. You know, when we confront with painful emotions, it lessens the impact. It just we adapt to them. It's what happened in Syria, right? When there's a fire outside of a house, you're very much interested in that. You just look through the window. But when the fire goes on for weeks and months, you just shut down the blinds and so that it doesn't disturb you. That's what happened in Turkey too, where there's a lot of news, a lot of numbers that we're tossing up all these numbers, 10,000, 15,000, and we get used to this. And I think it's important that with gatherings like this, we have a chance to highlight what's going on in Turkey, because what we see in Turkey in the past decade and a half is part of a populist upsurge that's been going on all across the world, including here in the United States, where, which is defined as a suspicion of or a hostility toward the elite or special interest groups, as Erdogan used to say, the interest lobby or dark evil global forces that targeting Turkey, using this kind of rhetoric, divisive rhetoric, to divide and rule the country. And Erdogan has been very skillful in promoting his agenda through this. When I look at how many journalists there in prisons, and I would say that more than 70 of them are from my newsroom colleagues. I mean, these are the colleagues that we rushed stories to the publication. These are the colleagues that we tried to cover demonstrations around Gezi. We were tear gassed by police with them. We asked questions to public officials during press conference with these people, and I can only imagine what they're going through, because many of them are in solitary confinement. They are not even allowed to read a book. The visitation is limited, and they receive a lot of letters from many prisoners who recount what kind of ordeal they're going through. I will just give one example. We have thousands of legal cases launched since the coup attempt, but there's no rule of law. Just one example from the Human Rights Watch. This is not something I'm making it up. It's just from Human Rights Watch. You can go online and check it out. It's one teacher who was dismissed after the coup. He was then imprisoned, and then he was beaten so badly, but he did not sign the confession that was presented to him. So under police custody, and the Turks can be detained up to 30 days without any charges because of the emergency rule. He was given a confession letter and said that you need to sign this. And when he didn't sign, they put a photo of his wife, said that, okay, this is your wife, name Ayşe, we know her address, we know that where she's going to groceries, we are watching where she's taking your kids to school, and if you do not sign this letter, we'll bring her here and rape before your own eyes. That's from the Human Rights Watch report. The Amnesty International reported the credible evidence of rampant torture in Turkish prison and widespread mistreatment. And there are a lot of indictments, there are a lot of forced confessions, and we don't really know what happened on July 15. And the reason why we don't know is because there's no independent platform we can discuss, we can debate that. I can't help but wonder when Erdogan is shutting down our newspaper, jailing our colleagues. Just the day after, we supported the civilian government on that night. When tanks were rolled in the streets, and when there were F-16s were bombing our parliament, the national symbol of our unity, whenever they are doing that, we supported the civilian government. We supported Erdogan government on that night against the military encroachment, military intrusiveness in politics. The next day, he started shutting down our newspapers, jailing our colleagues, and I can't help but wonder, are you trying to hide something? There's no way we can discuss it. There's no way we can debate it. I'm very much interested in knowing what happened on that night as much as everyone else. But how can I do that when I'm living in an exile and dozens of my colleagues are in jail and my newspapers are shut down? There's no single communication channel that I can reach out to our audience in Turkey. And so what we do is we're trying to put small pieces together, pieces of puzzle together, trying to understand what happened. And when you look at the narrative of the government, it's falling apart. And there's no one that can challenge the official narrative. There's no way that an academic, lawyer, journalist, anyone could challenge the official line in Turkey. Everyone is saying that has been the Gülen's job, they have to say it. There is no way that anyone is challenging that and gets away with that. There's no way. They will either lose their job or their freedom. And that's what happened when you look at the 80,000 people have been detained since the coup attempt. And that, just to give you an idea, in the past 3 years, we had only like 4,000 people, political dissidents, were thrown into jail. And in the past 5 months, 80,000 people. So you can see how the crackdown widened and deepened in Turkey. And those journalists that are in jail, I received some letters from some of them, and they are just recounting how they are so bored because they are not even allowed to read a book. And actually, it reminds me a kind of a torture in Hitler's Germany when he thrown those Jewish intellectuals into solitary confinement. The biggest torture was that they were not allowed to read a book or perhaps write one, and they were not allowed to meet anyone. And when you look at how many professors, how many intellectuals are in Turkish prisons, I can only imagine what they're going through inside those prisons. And not only domestically, but in the foreign policy too, Erdogan has been acting erratically. He already invaded northern Syria, targeting a Kurdish group called YPG, that's the most effective ground forces fighting against ISIS in northern Syria, also threatening to join a critical operation around Mosul to flush out ISIS militants there. And he has been using that populist, divisive rhetoric, tapping into the neo-Ottoman sentiments of the population, making some eccentric remarks about how our founding fathers were born and raised outside the Turkish borders, that's infuriating the neighbors. So this is the country, when you look at the country, our hard-won democracy in the past decade is now being destroyed, as much buried before the eyes of the world. And it's the rule of law, the mass purge, and the Wall Street Journal described this as the largest the world has seen in decades. When you look at the situation, when you look at how the European Union, the European Parliament advised the European Commission to suspend membership talks with Turkey, it only calls into question if Turkey is a reliable ally of the West. As Turkey is drifting away, slowly drifting away from democracy, it's also drifting away from the Western security institutions. And Erdogan is jumping on the Russian and Chinese bandwagon. Since the military coup attempt, Erdogan met with Putin for 4 times and talked on the phone for 5 times. They've been exchanging high-profile visits since then. And because Erdogan sees the West as a threat to his rule, not Russia, because Putin is not lecturing Erdogan about the human rights issues.